color society. But there are other things too. Secondly, the economic meltdown that the country is experiencing right now, right? Where all of a sudden you have white folks, not just black and brown folks, for whom economic security is never something that most black and brown peoples could take for granted. Black and brown folks have been dealing with double-digit unemployment forever, right? That's not new for everybody. People of color have been dealing with housing uncertainty forever. That's not new for everybody. People of color have been dealing with healthcare insecurity forever. That's not new for everyone. But all of a sudden you have white America. You got 200 million white folks that aren't totally convinced that everything's going to be okay. See, that's new. For generations, white America, by and large, with some exceptions, certainly for poor white folks, but by and large, white America was able to say, we're pretty confident, you know, that if we play by the rules, we do everything right, we work hard, we go to school, we go to college, you know, graduate, that everything will be all right and our kids will be better off than we were, and we were better off than our parents. And all of a sudden, you got millions of white folks in the midst of this economic collapse and we're starting to go, wait a minute. Wow, we might not know where our health care is coming from. We may not be able to afford a mortgage. And that creates a lot of anxiety, which is sort of ironic, right? Because like I said, for people of color, that's just every day. For people of color, adapting to that kind of uncertainty has been the name of the game. But when you've been privileged, when you've had the dominant group mentality that says, this isn't going to be my problem, this is somebody else's problem, and all of a sudden it becomes yours, it's like, what the hell, man? What's going on? Like, I'm losing my country. And then these folks have these rallies like back during the summer, the Tea Party rallies where they're screaming they want their country back, right? What do they mean when they say that? When they say, I want my country back, right? They're not just talking about going back to a day when there was a white president. That may be part of it, but they're talking about going back to that day when they didn't have to sweat the small stuff, right? Or very much big stuff, whereas people of color never, ever had that level of confidence and security about how the next generation was going to do. So it makes it hard to talk about race, right? Because how is it that white folks are going to care about racial inequality when they got their own problems? That's what I hear all around. Like, well, it's not that I'm unsympathetic. You know, I'm sure people of color have it rough, but man, I'm trying to find a job. I don't even know where and so now you can't even have that conversation because white folks are thinking, going sort of internal, right? Like, what am I going to do? How are my children going to go to college? How are we going to afford it? Now, theoretically, that insecurity could create solidarity. Right? If we were thinking ahead, white folks might say now is the time for us to be getting together with black and brown folk to ensure that we all have opportunity, because now we are facing some similar problems, but unfortunately, that's not what happens in periods of economic insecurity and periods of social change. We tend to sort of go inside ourselves and look at everybody else as an adversary. Right? Again, sort of ironic, because if we had thought that double-digit unemployment was a big deal when only black and Latino folks were dealing with it, when only Southeast Asian folks were dealing with it, when only indigenous Native North American folk were dealing with it, we might have done something about it, right? That would have prevented that from even happening to white folks. But white folks, when it was only black and brown folks dealing with double-digit unemployment and poverty rates that are as high as they are, it wasn't seen as a national crisis. Now that white folks are being affected by it, it's a national crisis. Now we got to have commissions to study it. Now we got to have bailouts to fix it. Now we got to do all kinds of stuff to help the dominant group that we never did when these things were facing just or mostly people of color. So the economic meltdown complicates the conversation. The demographic and population shifts complicate it. And having a president of color complicates it. Because for an awful lot of white Americans, we were able to take for granted all those years, whether we openly admitted it or not, able to take for granted that the president, the most symbolic representative of the country, think about it. That's the image that gets beamed around the world. When you think about America, the first thing people think of typically would be whoever the president is, because that's the person going to be in the news every day. That's the person whose face is going to be in the papers every day and on the nightly news. So when you have the ability to think of that symbol of America always going to look like you, and then all of a sudden you wake up one day and, oh my God, it's not. For the first time, you actually have to realize that America is not just about white folks. Right? That America never was just about white folks, but when you're the dominant group, you see you have that luxury of thinking that I am America and America is me. And so therefore, that leader, that person at the top is going to look like me. And when all of a sudden that changes, an awful lot of people aren't ready. Again, this is all very ironic though, because for people of color, folks of color have never been able to take for granted that they were going to be represented. People of color have never been able to take for granted that the image of themselves would be considered fully American. And yet people of color have survived and thrived in spite of that. And all of a sudden white folks just having to deal with a little bit, not even like losing power, right? Because white folks still have a disproportionate amount of the power. right? 85% of all the top jobs in the country still held by white folks, even if the president is not, right? 85% of the top jobs still in the hands of white folks, right? White folks have about 11 times the net worth of the typical black family, 8 times the net worth of the typical Latino family. That hasn't changed, right? Just because we have a president of color, but just the fact that white America has been able to take for granted what's called its hegemony, right? This hegemonic domination, this ability to say that out of 100% of stuff, I've got like damn near 100% of it. Like 95, 96, 97, then all of a sudden you wake up and it's only like 88%. Oh hell, what am I gonna do? You know, I only have 88% of the good stuff. Now, in real world terms, that's still an awful lot of power. But when you've gotten used to something, even a little bit of a reduction, right? When you've been king of the hill, right? Even a little bit of reduction in your power, even a little bit of reduction in having to share some of that power or influence gets magnified in your head like a million times over, as if the world is coming to an end for some folks. And so that's what we're seeing in some of these Tea Party rallies and all this stuff where folks are saying they want their country back. They're really talking about a time when they could take for granted that they were the norm, that they would turn on the television and who they would see representing them would look like them. And that's about white supremacy, and that's about white privilege. But the fourth thing that's complicating this conversation, not just the economics, not just the population change, and not just the fact that we have a president of color right now, a black man in the White House, is also this general sense that is being propagated by media, this general sense that is being propagated by political leaders, this general sense that is being propagated by an awful lot of spokespersons who happen to be white, that we are somehow living in this post-racial era. So that, if you've read my book, and I know several of you have because you came up and had me sign it, and I assume you read it, you didn't just want me to sign it, that I talk about it in there, right? Like the day after the election, the Wall Street Journal, the day of the election, Richard Cohen, who's a syndicated columnist, the week of the election, Frank Rich, who's another syndicated columnist, all wrote these editorials talking about how Barack Obama's political success proved that we were no longer living in a society where racism was a significant social force, that if it had been, he couldn't have won. In fact, Richard Cohen made the comment that I quoted in the book, right, that he actually used the phrase, "we have overcome," right, to describe Obama's victory, right, this sort of appropriating, ripping off, jacking civil rights language and using it as if to suggest that the mere election of this one man was all we needed to know that racism was dead. Now, of course, on the face of it, if we just think about it for a second, we can realize how ridiculous that is. The example that I use in the book, right, which I'll remind you of here, is thinking about countries like Pakistan, India, Israel, Great Britain. All 4 places have had women as the heads of state, right? Pakistan elected a woman to be president, Benazir Bhutto, back in 1988. She was re-elected again, I believe, in 91. So she actually served 2 terms as the head of state in Pakistan, but no one in their right mind would say that women in Pakistan are treated fully equally now, that sexism is no longer an issue, or in Israel just because Golda Meir was the premier, or in India because Indira Gandhi was, or in Great Britain because Margaret Thatcher was. Do we really think that girls and women, just because of that, now have fully equal opportunity? Of course not. No one would ever even make that argument, right? But in this country, that's the argument that's getting made about race just because of Barack Obama, right? Which makes no more sense here than it would make in those other places about gender and about sexism. But what's scary is that this notion that America is beyond race, and so we don't have to have these conversations. That America is beyond race, and so we don't even have to have Black History Month. That's what some folks have been saying. We don't need to have it now. We got a black president. Why have Black History Month? Right? We'll just celebrate that on President's Day now because we got a black president. We don't even have to do it, right? I mean, I'm not making this up. This is what columnists are writing. And by the way, not just white columnists. The actual argument for eliminating Black History Month was first floated by a black columnist at the Atlanta newspaper, right after the election of Barack Obama, basically saying, we don't need this anymore, right? It was Will Smith, right? Man of color, very well-paid man of color. Will Smith getting up on the Oprah show and saying that what he liked about Barack Obama was that because he had won, now all of our excuses are gone, right? What does that mean? First of all, how disrespectful, right? Because it implies that black and brown folks who talk about racism are just making excuses. Racism is not an excuse, it's a reason.